I think we'll get started to this first webinar focused on accelerating clean energy access in rural areas. The webinar series that we're kicking off today is bridging the United Nations Food Systems Summit with the Climate Change COP26. It aligns with CGIAR's knowledge support to the Climate Resilient Development Pathways Alliance out of the UNFSS, and it supports both adaptation and mitigation processes in low and middle income countries. And this particular session reflects key elements of a new CGIAR initiative that was recently developed on Nexus Gains, realizing multiple benefits across water, energy, food, and ecosystems. My name is Claudia Ringler, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Water, Land, and Ecosystems Research Program of CGIAR, and I welcome you to this great event. The lack of reliable energy access, as well as water and food insecurity, is slowing agricultural and economic growth and well-being in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. The importance of rural energy access has been heightened during COVID-19, where digital connections that require reliable energy access were often the only ones available. Investments, however, in accelerating rural energy access have slowed as a result of the pandemic, reducing the chance of increased climate resilience in rural areas. This session first discusses findings from recent CGIAR energy research, as well as linkages to food system transformation and climate resilience. We will then hear from eminent panelists on where CGIAR should focus its future energy research portfolio in the next decade. I would now like to invite Dr. Shilp Verma, a senior researcher with the International Water Management Institute and the Water, Land and Ecosystems Research Program, to talk about solar-led trajectories for food system transformation. Please add questions you might have to Dr. Shilp Verma in the Q&A box throughout the presentation, and we will answer it as part of our Q&A session later on. Thank you very much. Over to Dr. Verma. You're muted. Yeah.
Yeah. I hope everyone can see my screen. I'm going to talk about 4 different transformation trajectories where solar irrigation can play a role in transforming food systems. And most of the work that I'm going to share today is based on the work that EME and WLE and other CG centers have been doing in Asia and Africa, where solar irrigation is slowly becoming popular. And we'll talk about what kind of opportunities exist in transforming food systems through solar-led growth. Solar-powered irrigation offers 1,400 to 2,200 peak hours of reliable and affordable energy to farmers for irrigation. This is available almost throughout the developing world. If you look at the map, this is from World Bank's Global Solar Atlas. Almost all the countries in the south have excellent solar energy resources. So that also points to the potential of this source of energy. And most of the action so far has happened in South Asia. India leads with about 93% of the off-grid solar capacity for irrigation. Bangladesh is another major player, but there is tremendous potential also in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Latin America and rest of the world. So this basically offers opportunities for transforming food systems in a way that will be smallholder friendly. I'm going to talk about 4 ways that this can happen. Now, the 4 key trajectories, the first one is where rain-fed agriculture can be sustainably moved to irrigated agriculture. By offering affordable and reliable energy for pumping water, solar irrigation pumps can offer improved water control. And there is plenty of research available which shows that this leads to higher land and water productivity. It increases the gross and net returns from agriculture. And in the current context of climate change, it will also improve climate resilience, because even small amount of protective irrigation can significantly improve the resilience of agriculture to climatic shocks. Now, a lot of the potential of this is, of course, in the areas which are currently rain-fed. A lot of this potential area is in sub-Saharan Africa, but there are also parts of South Asia, Latin America, and Middle East and Central Asia where these opportunities exist. The second trajectory is about transforming diesel or petrol-led irrigation to solarized irrigation. Now, diesel, which is most popular in South Asia, and petrol, which is popular in parts of Africa, both of these are very costly especially for smallholders to irrigate with. And our research in India shows that because of the high cost of diesel, farmers tend to under-irrigate, and that also leads to lower agriculture productivity. Both of these are also very highly polluting sources of energy. So solarizing diesel and petrol pumps can also have significant impact on reducing pollution, reducing the carbon footprint of irrigation, as well as significantly reducing the pumping cost or cost of irrigation for small farmers. Through this also, there is potential for improved climate resilience. Much of these opportunities exist in the pockets of the world where already there is intensive irrigation, but it is constrained by the high cost of energy. This includes Eastern India and Bangladesh, but also Pakistan, Punjab, and pockets in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. Now, the third trajectory, which is not very widely common, but it is a growing opportunity, is to solarize even the grid-connected pumps. Now, South Asia has plenty of them. India alone has about 15 or 16 million pumps which are connected to the grid and run on electricity. And almost all of this electricity is provided either free or at highly subsidized prices to farmers. In the South Asian context, this has been one of the key drivers of excessive groundwater pumping and groundwater depletion. And some of the work that IMI has done in India was to develop a model of solar irrigation promotion, where solar irrigation is basically promoted as a crop. So it's an additional crop that the farmers can grow. Solar energy is. And by doing that, the basic idea is to connect the solar pumps to the grid, allow the farmers to use all the energy that they need for irrigation, but also evacuate the surplus energy back to the grid and earn some income out of it. What we found is that this is one politically acceptable way of converting farmers who are dependent on subsidized or free power and converting them into solar energy producers and greening the grid. This is right now a big issue in India, but as the grid connectivity improves in other parts of the world, there will be growing pressure on politicians to offer free or subsidized power to farmers, even in Africa. This has also happened in other parts of the world. Saudi Arabia did it, Iran did it, Mexico has done it. And in all of these locations, doing this, although it is a popular thing for farmers, it has led to excessive use of groundwater. So we find that promoting solar power as a remunerative crop can also improve the incentives of farmers to become efficient energy and water users, and it can become an instrument of groundwater governance. Finally, all solar irrigation pumping systems by design have surplus energy available, because irrigation demand is not constant throughout the year, but generation is more or less stable. That means that there will always be excess surplus capacity in solar irrigation systems. And since a lot of these systems are going to be installed through public funding, we feel that it's only right that these capacities are utilized to the maximum. There are now studies and also field experiments of using the surplus energy for other productive purposes in agriculture. And I think this will be another way in which solar irrigation can transform food systems, by offering energy not only for irrigation, but also for food processing, electric fences, threshers, land preparation. A lot of the other energy needs of farmers can also be met through the solar energy. Now, so finally, I want to conclude by saying that IMI and WLE's work in Asia and Africa suggests that solar pumps are more than just green pumping solutions or clean energy, they can become sources of solving several problems in one go. They will definitely transform global food systems as the prices of solar technologies are falling. They will enable shift to irrigated agriculture. They will make irrigation more affordable and equitable, more accessible to small farmers, enhance climate resilience, and fix perverse incentives. All of this while reducing the carbon footprint. The focus where we need to work more is on developing smart business models, appropriate financing mechanisms, and proper technology transfer with capacity building of farmers. Thank you.
Thank you, Shilp. Really excellent presentation explaining how these trajectories are slowly covering the globe, or at least South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Very interesting. So we are now zooming into a single country, Ethiopia, and we'll hear our second Ignite talk by Dr. David McConnell, who is a researcher with the International Food Policy Research Institute and also the Waterland Ecosystems Research Program. And he will talk about CGIAR's work on accelerating rural energy access in Ethiopia. David, over to you.
Thanks, Claudia, and hello, everyone. I'm happy to present some of EUMI's and IFPRI's, as well as some CGIAR Center's work on accelerating rural energy access. The focus of my presentation is really on productive uses, but I will spend a minute to highlight some of the work that we have been working on, but we'll focus on the productive uses. Okay, so some CGIAR research on rural energy access in Ethiopia includes a regional energy system model for Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, where we have shown that trading, electric energy trading in these three countries can reduce system costs and can be used as a way for regional integration. There is a work by IFPRI that helps in the development of energy system models for Ethiopia. And also, IFPRI has assessed the relative feasibility to accelerate private small-scale irrigation with solar pumps versus diesel pumps. Another work that we can highlight is a work by EUMI and IFPRI that supports the understanding of cost effectiveness of hybrid rural decentralized energy systems for productive uses and other uses as well. There has been some work, particularly in collaboration with Rocky Mountain Institute and IFPRI, where we have seen the synergies between rural electrification and 6 agricultural production and processing opportunities in Ethiopia. And there is also another work currently being done in understanding or coming up with a spatially explicit estimation of energy demand for irrigation by different energy types, cost-effective ways of meeting that energy demand for irrigation. This is a work by IFPRI, and which is funded by the Energy and Economic Growth Program at Oxford. So, but for the remainder of this small presentation, I will focus on the key productive uses of energy in agriculture, and I group them into 3. The first one is the use of biomass for improving farm productivity versus its use to meet domestic energy demand. The second one is energy as a requirement for agricultural intensification. And the third one is electricity or energy for value addition in terms of agricultural processing. I will say a few words in these 3 main or key productive uses of energy in agriculture in the Ethiopian context. So, but as a way of background, I would like to first give some highlights on the type of energy being used for lighting and cooking purposes in Ethiopia. The graph, the figure on top left shows that electricity access, or particularly for lighting from the grid, is very minimal in rural Ethiopia. So this is from World Bank data, and it's around 12% from the grid. In 2014 and 2016, there could be some movements in recent years. But most of the lighting comes from either biomass or some dry cell and electric batteries. But a recent phenomenon is solar lighting has become prominent that actually exceeds the grid electricity. But if you add all these grid electricities, solar and dry cell, the amount of or the share of households who use these sources for domestic cooking purposes is negligible. So more or less, the entire use for domestic cooking and heating purposes is coming from biomass. Actually, if you focus on injera baking for in rural areas, you see that close to 98% comes from wood-burning traditional stoves or metals, as we call them. There are only about 2% of improved stoves, but the role of electricity is close to zero. So that takes us into the first linkages of agriculture, energy use in agriculture. And a work we've done in the past shows that rural households with and without electricity spend the same amount of time collecting fuel wood, cow dung, and other biomass. So that shows that even already the amount of people having access to electricity is small, but even among those who have electricity, the focus has been mostly on until recently at least, has been on lighting rather than providing appliances for productive uses. And this research has also shown that removal of these biomasses and spending time on collecting fuel woods has reduced agricultural productivity in the farm. So the second pathway or the second key use of energy in rural agriculture in rural areas is as energy for agricultural intensification. And Ethiopian agriculture is characterized by very low mechanization, which is about 0.1 kilowatt per hectare. And if you compare that to, say, for instance, India's 2 kilowatt per hectare or China's 6 kilowatt per hectare, it shows how the amount of energy being used in Ethiopia's agriculture is very minimal. And most of the energy in Ethiopia's agriculture is the one embodied in chemical fertilizers, which has been increasing over time. But investment in agriculture continues to be the government of Ethiopia's priority, with emphasis on infrastructure, including water and irrigation schemes. At least there are, until recently, 13 ongoing large-scale irrigation projects with a combined command area of more than 400,000 hectares. So irrigation is expected to be high on the agenda. But when it comes to energy use, even in irrigation, most of it is coming either from gravity or from diesel pumps. These are the two main. So most of the energy in irrigation is coming from diesel pumps, but there are also some variations in terms of crop choices, in terms of operation and maintenance costs, and net returns that vary by different energy options in irrigation. The third key production use in Ethiopia's agriculture is in terms of energy for value addition and agro-processing. Obviously, electrification has a huge potential to help rural smallholders increase their agricultural productivity and venture into agro-processing. For instance, the work we've done with RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute, showed that in 6 chosen selected production and processing opportunities, particularly for horticulture irrigation, grain milling, injera baking, milk cooling, and bread baking, there is a potential to produce close to $4 billion in annual value using electric appliances by 2025. And supplying appliances for these 6 value chains itself is a $380 million. And the result also shows that we can produce an additional $22 million for the utility by stretching the energy for other uses. But in the end, what needs to happen is I think the key question. If we want to improve energy use in agriculture in Ethiopia, a well-performing national productive use program needs value chain infrastructures. So that includes rural electrification and market infrastructures, but also it includes appliance supply chains in terms of manufacturing and import of appliances, or appliance performance standards, warranties, and servicing. It also includes the development of enabling finance in terms of providing affordable loans for smallholders, capacity building for microfinance institutes, and making loans and credits accessible. On the other hand, it requires extension services in terms of business operation support and community awareness outreach programs. I think that will be it, and thank you for listening.
Yep, thank you for those insights and all these exciting opportunities for accelerating rural energy access in Ethiopia. I would now like to hand over to our panel moderator, Dr. Petra Schmitter. She's a senior irrigation specialist with the World Bank, and she will take you into the next part of the session. Petra, thanks so much.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you, everyone. Before we dive into the questions that we have prepared to our great panelists, let me take a moment to introduce them to you, and also to remind you to please put any questions you might have in the Q&A box, and don't use the chat for questions. So first of all, I would like to introduce Dr. Ku McMahon, who serves as a team lead for the Water Energy for Food, a Grand Challenge for Development program at USAID, the Global Development Lab. He also has led the former Securing Water for Food Challenge program, and so far has seen grants and technical assistance support over 75 innovations in over 60 countries. And of course, all focus around how do we produce more with less water and energy. Next, we will also have Dr. Yo Puri, who is the Associate Vice President and Knowledge Department at IFAD, and she leads the organization strategy work in IFAD's key areas, targeting agriculture, climate, gender, nutrition, youth, and social inclusion. And that's really a mouthful and all very important to IFAD's operations, policy, and resource mobilization. And Jo also worked before at the Green Climate Fund, so really brings in that broader perspective. And last but not least, we have His Excellency Dr. Frihiwood Woldehana, the State Minister for Energy at the Ministry of Water, Irrigation and Energy in Ethiopia. In his current function, he oversees the Ethiopian Electric Power, the Ethiopian Electric Utility, and the Ethiopian Energy Authority institutions, among many other tasks in the energy sector. And he focuses on executing the National Electrification Program, which is a very ambitious program for grid expansion and densification, as well as off-grid solutions and solar mini-grids among solar home systems. So welcome to all the panelists. It's great to have you with us. Let's kick off straight away with the first question that I have for Dr. Ku in relation to what we have heard earlier. So we had Shilp present on the 4 solar pathways, and we also heard from Dr. Dawit about the value chain approaches and really how we have to have that, comprehensive approach if we want to transform the energy sector. So Dr. Ku, my first question, based on your experience in your challenge programs, some of the great energy innovations you have come across, what does it really take to accelerate scale and access actually in rural areas?
And thank you, Petra, for inviting me to join you for this dialogue and engage. And thanks to all of the participants, both the speakers, the panelists, and those watching online. And so just a little bit of background on what Water and Energy for Food is, the program I'm managing. It's a $65 million joint initiative by the German Foreign Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, through GIZ, the European Union, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, Sweden, through the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, and USAID, where I sit. And the objective of the program is to scale groundbreaking water, energy, food innovations that improve food security and help reduce poverty in an environmentally sustainable, pro-women, and holistic way. And we accomplish that through our regional innovation hubs. So we believe you have to do it locally to really get those solutions to scale with smallholder farmers. So we are in East Africa, West Africa, now in Southern and Central Africa. We have a hub in the Middle East and North Africa, and then one in South and Southeast Asia. And this is similar to CGIAR's planned efforts to establish and to facilitate a cross-sectoral, multi-stakeholder platform. So in general, I'm looking forward to the work that will be done through the One CGIAR Nexus Gains initiative, as many of the areas of your focus align with the challenges that we work on, specifically the themes of gender, water security, clean and renewable energy, climate change, and the scalable of those Nexus innovations with a focus on the private sector and investors. And I think that's the key piece there, is that by focusing on women and the impact of the Nexus for women, that's where we can be critical to improving the Nexus, as they represent a large proportion of smallholder farmers in many of the areas where we're talking about working. As we've learned from securing water for food, power, and agriculture, the WEFREP predecessors, it's not enough to use a one-size-fits-all approach around these gender-related activities, and it has to be specific and concrete and actionable work that we're working with. Also, CGIAR's work with NGO governments is going to be critical, as NGOs and governments can mitigate the effects of climate change felt by women, girls, and other vulnerable populations. So WEFREP's partnership with the National Coordination of Water Users, CNU, in Niger enables women's access to water through solar-powered pumps, which improves food security and water security. And as the new initiative also covers, water security plays a huge role in energy access and food security and agricultural production, and it's critical to develop innovations and technologies that can meet the challenges of affecting the rural smallholder farmers whose crops feed urban populations. And one of those key areas that we're now focused on is the pressure on climate change on water security and energy security, and the need for the innovations that help end users better understand and use both the water that they currently have and these new technologies that come on board. And so the innovative technologies like Internet of Things enabled tools, digital solutions can better enable farmers to know when to water their crops and how much water should be used, like so in Morocco and Mozambique in Vietnam. But one of the key areas that we think is really lacking, and we've seen through our previous experience and where we're headed now, is around investment. And related to that investment focus, CGIAR scaling of gender-sensitive business and financing models through the investment by the private sector and also through governments is going to be a key piece to the scaling. And we also focus on that key innovation effort through improving end-user financing models and providing investment readiness technical assistance to the businesses who have these innovations that are ready for private investment through smallholder farmers. So I'd say strengthening that Nexus government, working on the enabling environment for businesses, and working with men and women smallholder farmers around climate mitigation and adaptation efforts is going to be key. And I think both WEFREP and the One CGIAR Nexus initiative will be able to help move those pathways forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ku. And that was a great segue to Dr. Joyce's question, because you talked about financing, you talk about the importance of women and gender to accelerate scale and the holistic approaches and the enabling environment. So coming now to IFAD and the strategy and action plan on environment and climate change, which is very ambitious, how is IFAD as a key rural development actor actually supporting the women and men farmers in lowering the barriers for energy access?
Thanks very much, Petra. I really appreciate it, and wonderful to be here. So I think a few things are possibly key to point out before I go into the specifics of how IFAD is helping. As you noted in the introduction that you made of me, I think one of the key things that IFAD recognized quite early on is that it is okay, while most institutions think about gender and youth and nutrition and social inclusion, what happens in most institutions, with malice towards no one, is that everybody tends to think in silos. And it's really important to think about these in integrated ways. And so one example IFAD moving in that direction and really making sure that we are talking about integrated programming is the fact that there is a division of environment, climate, nutrition, gender, social inclusion, and youth, right? Which therefore means that you have to integrate all of these themes into each one of your investments as you go forward. And it's not okay to think of these in separate ways. Having said that, it clearly is also important to think about, well, what are the targets that we are setting when we are talking about women, when we are talking about gender, and when we are talking about social inclusion. And this is true for energy access and renewable energy access, but it's basically true across all of our programming. And one thing that illustrates that is the fact that IFAD will distinguish between just ensuring that women are targeted, which is essentially what is called mainstreaming women, but distinguishing that from being transformative, which is a very different bar altogether, right? Which is basically saying that an institution is making or is seeking to bring about a step change in the overall programming and the condition of populations that it is targeting. Within this then, as background, in the case of renewable energy technologies, IFAD does both. So it's a lending institution, which means that it gives loans and it gives non-grants, but it also does do, to some extent, grants as well. But this gives us abilities to essentially construct financial instruments that can help smallholder farmers think about taking either loans, which are usually highly concessional below market, but also combine them with technical assistance, which is usually provided as grants. And so these are blended financial instruments that are provided to not just national governments, but also go down the value chain and trickle down to our end user beneficiary. So one example of how this works is what is called digressive insurance. So one of the things that I discovered in my own research as we were looking at the uptake of insurance of financial instruments, especially amongst poor rural farmers, men and women, is that you can put out all of these innovations all you want, including renewable energy technologies, but the capital cost and the missing markets essentially mean that a lot of these households don't pick them up. Absorption rates of even something as actuarially fair as insurance, as agricultural insurance, doesn't get taken up by rural households. And the overall absorption rate or take-up rate, even just in the first year of an insurance product going out, is about 20%. 20%, only 20% of your targeted group actually will pick up an insurance instrument, even when it is actuarially fair. So what is required is that you have to change the way markets are pricing this, and you're providing incentives. Digressive insurance, just one example, is one illustration of how this works. So when IFAD comes in, it will put up a digressive insurance instrument, which means that for the first year, 90% of the insurance premium is paid for through IFAD resources, and only 10% of the premium actually has to be paid by the end user beneficiary. In the second year, it's 75-25. So 75 picked up by IFAD, 25 by the end user. Third year is 50-50, and then it reduces down. But essentially, then you create a longer term norm in using financial instruments that might look otherwise quite burdensome to smallholder farmers. This is what we are doing, for example, in Mali, in the Sahel, in Kenya, in several other contexts in Africa, but also in Asia, to ensure that a lot of the innovations that IFAD is putting out, especially in the context of renewable energy technologies and with respect to low emission climate resilient technologies and pathways and processes, get taken up and absorbed by smallholder farmers. And within this, just to close, is also an additional target. So we are ensuring that we have target specifically in each one of the investments. We have targets for the number of women that are reached out to, but also the number of women whose behavior is transformed and or changed as a consequence of these investments. And those targets have to be more than 50% or usually 60% of the targeted population. Thanks.
Wow, that sounds really exciting, and I can't wait to hear more about it. Let me actually move now from that to Ethiopia, where we're going to ask His Excellency Dr. Frehiwot about the implementation of the ambitious Rural Energy Access Acceleration Program in Ethiopia, and I would love to hear how that relates to what we have just heard around the financing. His Excellency, please, can you tell us a little bit more about your program?
Okay, thank you, Petra. Thank you also for inviting me to be part of this event, this really academic discussion, we can say. Very interesting. I thank both presenters for their excellent presentation of data, part of their research. So fortunately, their work is in line with our activities. Actually, when we talk about the National Electrification Program, it was started in 2017, and the objective is simply universal access. But in NEP2, that's the second version of National Electrification Program, we focus on off-grid technologies, and part of it is productive use. Okay, when we say off-grid technologies, we mainly mean solar technologies, solar home systems, or solar pumping systems for agricultural application, and so on. So there are a number of pilot projects along these lines to justify, the technology. Obviously, the technology works, but the main issue is whether or not it is affordable, or whether or not it requires a huge investment or a huge subsidy. Okay, so it's not just like other technologies. So it has to be supported by policies. Okay, and to this end, we are still in the pilot phase. There are some applications, but they are not really enough. If we want to exploit the potential, then we need to move quickly from pilot phase to rollout. Almost every household farmer, or even medium to large scale farming, they should be enjoying the solar potential, the solar radiation. They have to use irrigation, because ordinary rain-fed irrigation is maybe just once, or in some cases twice in a year. But with solar irrigation, it's possible to continuously get different types of crops, and extra crops should definitely justify the extra cost. But you have to show numbers, practical numbers, and this is probably what we need from research. Okay, so to be done, well, there are actually a number of programs. We have already planning 65% of our population should get electricity from the grid, because that's an area which roughly covers, or is covered by, the national grid. And the remaining 35% is a bit away from the grid, and they must be supported by off-grid technologies. They could be solar home systems or solar mini grids, depending on their location and so on. So through time, we'll see exactly which locations are to be covered by which technology. GIS mapping is part of our plan, and it can show potential areas. And with the least cost approach, we'll be able to provide access. And in the rural areas, it's not only lighting, but also support for agriculture. It's very important. And to this end, there are other initiatives, like, for instance, local manufacturing. The government encourages local manufacturing of different technologies. and solar pumping, and it's just one of them. One of them, even more important, like private sector engagement, because everything cannot be handled by the government, or it must be available right at the rural areas. So that will be achieved if the local private sector can be actively engaged, okay? And also proper management, from some of the implementation, we learned that, technology is set up and it works fine for the initial period, maybe 1 year or so. And then when it is broken for any reason, there are no people for operation and maintenance. So that kind of proper management, not only for installation, but also for maintenance and different types of maintenance, from simple cleaning to maybe replacement of components and the like. So this kind of capacity must be built right in the rural areas. No one can really shuttle to do these things. It's really impossible. So these are the things that we really we're really heading. And from research institutions, what we expect is continuous technical and economic assessments of systems, with specific technology specific plus local context. The type of crop might vary. The research that you have done in, let's say, Argentina or Mali may be different from what is really required here. So it requires some local study. And I think with that, it's possible to support the rapid implementation of the program and also implementation of productive use. That's what I can say. I mean, if there are questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, His Excellency. And I kept an eye on the Q&A, and what we're going to do now is do another round of questions to each of you after you have shared what you're focusing on and how. And you already also answered the question, where do you see some of these knowledge gaps? But I would like to deep dive a little bit more into that. Dr. Q, from everything you've heard so far, and again, reflecting on some of that enabling environment, what does it take to reach scale, and the role the private sector plays within that. Could you elaborate a little bit more on some of the specific knowledge gaps, being maybe on the resource use, the policy, that you would think we should focus on first, like a first priority focus for the One CG?
Sure. So I think one of the key areas as far as the resource gaps is in some countries, the connections between the private sector actors who have the technologies and the government actors who would be managing or monitoring these technologies that could help disseminate and distribute these through either extension services or other government programs are a bit lacking and limited. And so that group of private sector actors who have these technologies available are sometimes not able to make those direct connections with the local and the national governmental sources. The second is with relation to import-export tariffs for some of these technologies. To put some of the technologies together requires parts sometimes coming from other countries, and those, if they're not produced locally, can make those technologies extremely costly and therefore not cost competitive when it comes to smallholder farmers. And then I'd say third is there's a gap between the current financing schemes, even those that work in the agricultural banks of smallholder farmers, and the willingness to provide loans and credit for these types of water and energy technology. So I think all of those are key gaps that currently exist in many countries throughout the world that we would need to address to try to get these things to scale.
Thanks. And actually, let me pick up on that last point, because you mentioned very clearly the finance and the, you know, how do we finance then some of those markets that are a bit more risky for those innovations. And Dr. Joe, you mentioned earlier some of the innovative financing that IFAD is trying out and sharing. But again, in order to deploy that on a larger scale, what are some of these knowledge gaps to ensure not only the equitability of the access to these innovations, but also the sustainability, both from a financial perspective for companies and or smallholder farmers, as well as the environment?
Yeah, thanks, Petra. Big questions, no?
So that's why we're here for, right?
Yeah. So I think let me first talk about the knowledge gap. But you know, there are three different questions in just the first one question that you asked. One is equity. The other one is sustainability, not just of the financial models, but also of the impact, right? And then where is the knowledge gap? So let me try and address that. So in terms of knowledge gap, you know, in an earlier life, not so long ago, we actually did a knowledge gap map or an evidence gap map of high quality evidence in trying to understand where's a lot of low emission climate resilient investment taking place and where do we have knowledge. So this is basically mapping it on a grid, and I can explain more if you want. But what we found is that where evidence tends to focus, high quality evidence tends to focus, is not where most investments are going. And conversely, where investments are going is not where we are actually funding high quality evidence. And so one example is institutional capacity and enabling environments. So the World Bank, I know IFAD, and a whole lot of multilateral institutions spend a lot of resources, including human capacity, in building and focusing their investments on creating enabling environments. But to what extent are these actually effective? To what extent do they make you know, the world system, so to speak, pivot in directions that are becoming far more propitious for energy use and renewable energy use, and just across the system to far more sustainable development pathways, is still a question that we have not been able to answer through the use of high quality evidence. If you looked at the investments that GCF has made, or even the German government, and so we had data on all of this and we looked at all of it, we found that there was a clear mismatch between evidence, which was coming in on small tweaks on behavior change. So there was good data on behavior change, but actually not much of it saying that, yes, it works, just telling us that, well, it's still unclear as to whether it works. And so we have to remain agnostic. But on policy change, we didn't have really good evidence. So that's on the knowledge gap question. On the equity question, I think the answers in the question, which is really, I think what we are struggling to do is to really ensure that we have disaggregated data on behavior, right? So if you're looking at women or if you're looking at youth, for me, a large part of the advocacy that I have to do, but also the cajoling or the threatening that I have to do, is to really get everyone to see that there is a huge amount of importance that has to be associated with getting disaggregated data. And it's not just sufficient to count populations. So that's the equity, and within sample, intra-group distribution indicators that I really am trying to push through our investments as well. But equity remains a concern, and one of the challenges, especially with financing mechanisms that we have found, is that clearly you need collateral when you go to the bank, even for digressive insurance and for all of the other forms of formal financial mechanisms. If you go to the informal market, very different, but insurance rates are far higher. Madagascar insurance rates in the informal markets are 50%. IFAD can go in with lower rates of interest, but guess what? Only the people who qualify are usually men who have got access to collateral such as land. So it becomes really quite easy to see that, yes, you have to think about equity at the same point as you're thinking about access to financing mechanisms for renewable energy technologies that have high initial capital costs, for example, and where women and other marginalized groups might remain out of the system, especially when you're tapping the formal financial markets. And most formal financial market systems actually have the unintended consequence of leaving out a lot of these groups, and which is why we make it a part of our target group as target as well within these programs. And then the last question was on sustainability. If you look at some of the, I'm not going to say that they're innovative, but they're interesting forms of financing renewable energy technologies. So pay as you go, build, operate, and transfer, blended finance, where you give the grant, but then if the innovation becomes successful, then you are able to scale it up and go forward, but you are the first risk taker and the first loss taker. And they're very different things, but IFAD acts as the first risk taker as well as the first loss taker, right? And so by de-risking a lot of these investments, then what you're doing is you're making these technologies ready for the public space. And you're going in where very few private investors are really keen to go in at the beginning. And we are also doing things that are things such as reimbursable technical assistance, which is if the technical assistance turns out to meet the conditions of repayment, then those are paid back, but otherwise they become essentially non-returnable grants. So these are all mechanisms or financial mechanisms through which we are trying to scale up a lot of the innovation that is required in the renewable space. Thanks.
Thank you. And I have so many questions more, but unfortunately, I have to move on to His Excellency because we're going to get close to the end of our webinar. So His Excellency, Dr. Frehiwot, I just wanted to ask you one more question. Listening to the knowledge gaps, both on the innovation side, the enabling environment, and even the financing. Being now the state minister and aiming really to roll out, you mentioned, you know, at least 65% should have access to all sorts of renewable energy. And at the same time, even the local manufacturing to come over some of these challenges of technology access in Ethiopia. Where do you see the first top 3 knowledge gaps really that could help you achieve your targets?
Well, the knowledge gaps, actually, we can summarize it in short, but it is a bit wide because there are many areas. We cannot cover all of them in such a short discussion. But in relation to the electrification program, well, there are knowledge gaps in identification and changing to practice, or you may not say implementing, but really transforming theory into practice under local condition. Okay, that could lead to local manufacturing. That could lead to even local interpretation. Okay, so there is some gap, relating local problems to basic principles. There is some gap, and that might come to, it might have solutions through time. Capacity building is one way of doing it. Collaboration is another way of doing it. So there are some gaps, but we can list them down. It may not be that really conclusive for our discussion. But maybe I was looking at the the Q&A box I had seen. I don't know if I can.
Sure, you want to pick out a question? Yeah, absolutely.
Well, there is actually one question for Dr. Dawit. He says, it says, any update on GERD, our project? I don't know if it has any relevance to our discussion here, but it's simply an ongoing project, and the first early generation will take place within the next few days or week, whatever. So it goes on, okay? So it's an active project. That's all I can say. But another question is perhaps what's the main challenge facing Ethiopia's farmers? Well, one of the challenge is actually finance. That's obvious. There should be acquisition of technologies in order to really improve agriculture, local agriculture. But other challenges are also there. And this, I wish if there were people from Ministry of Agriculture and also agencies like agricultural transformation agencies, they're working on with the farmers right in the field, and they know more questions, more right from the farmers' viewpoint. But from outside, I can see it's just finance. For instance, solar technologies are useful not only for solar pumping and also even for agricultural activities. Post-harvest activities. There could be agro-processing, agro-industries, which need a certain amount of energy, but I think still it lies in the finance. Finance, how do we make available? There are some experience, through this microfinance institutions, but still it is in its infant stage. Okay, it's not at a level that we really want. So there is something that we have to do in the future. To really do something. So that's I can say maybe. I think that's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think finance was definitely a red thread to the story from the presentation all the way to the panel discussion. So it's definitely something to continue to focus on. I would like to thank our panelists for taking the time of joining us today. I know you're all very busy. You have a lot to do. So thank you very much. I would like to now hand over to Ms. Simi Kamal, who is the founder and CEO of CGIAR Foundation in Pakistan, a foundation for water, food and livelihood security. And she also is the convener of a think tank on the rational use of water. I would like to hear from her as she also serves on the board of the International Water Management Institute and is involved in several other initiatives, what her takeaway messages were for this webinar and where she sees the potential for taking this up in the next Nexus Gains initiative for the One CG. Ms. Simi, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here and meeting old friends and new friends. So I was asked to think about how CGIAR research could truly support rural men and women in strengthening access to key resources, including energy. And to address that and what Petra has just said, I think I'd like to remind everyone that the CGIAR institutions were part of the past war efforts to propel food security across the world. And the CGIAR institutions that worked on wheat, rice, and potato hybrids, it wasn't just research, it's then action right on the ground. And if you look, I mean, I remember as a young person going to shop for rice and finding Irri rice. So the rice, the hybrids produced by Irri were actually called Irri rice. I think that might still be the case across South Asia and perhaps in parts of Africa as well. So some of the takeaways that I could share with you is that, the term nexus of water, energy, food, and ecosystem nexus is very beautiful. It's very nice to reflect in policy. It can be understood easily. But when we come to implementing it, that is where we meet a lot of issues. For example, water, we have to talk about security. For food, we talk about security. For energy, we talk about reliable access in rural areas. And for ecosystems, we talk about all the services that ecosystems can provide and how they are to be strengthened. So where is it that we want to see this nexus actually operational? I think that's very much at the local level. So, and CGIAR and IMI and other institutions, IFPRI included, have offices in many countries. So those country offices and then down into the rural areas where poverty is the greatest. I'll just share with you for Pakistan, 220 million people. 60% live below the poverty line. And the feminization of poverty is very, very obvious. I was running a $300 billion program until recently, of which $100 billion were for off-grid energy programs for the poorest areas, poorest people, women and girls, and the most vulnerable through a poverty graduation program and for targeting women. So if you think about that, we have a lot of issues on how we get people to invest in rural energy programs. And there are two ways we could do it. The first one, of course, is in off-grid areas where the system would have to be different. And the other one, of course, is in areas where grids are already operational. I've seen in many South Asian countries that net metering programs really work, and the poor can do it too. So if they have solar panels, they could actually make electricity and feed it into the grid and get paid for it. So that's one area we need to look at. Secondly, I fully agree with what I have heard, that the microfinance bank working on group guarantee and others, they need to really pick up their act. Because very often when some of these banks are being bought out by the normal banks, they're saying, leave aside microfinance for energy and for other issues, and let's get into SMEs. The minute you get into SMEs, you then lose the attention of the poorest. So I'd like to say that whether it's IFAD or the World Bank, we have to be really, really careful on how we develop these off-grid solar access programs for the poor, especially in the rural areas. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Okay, so I'm actually taking back the rein here, and I would like to thank Simi and all of the panelists and our moderator and everyone in the audience for attending this very exciting event. I think we have learned a lot. We've heard about great entry points on how to move things forward, a lot of suggestions on what CGIAR should be doing, how we can work better with organizations like CGIAR Foundation of Simi Kamal, but many other organizations and many other countries. So I think really a lot of food for thought. And I would like to close this reminding everyone that this is the first webinar in a longer series, and our next session is actually already this Thursday, October 7th. We are bridging from the Food System Summit to COP26, so there's not a lot of weeks. So on Thursday, we will hear about drought and flood risk reduction strategies that, similar to rural energy access, are important both for food security, food system transformation, and to meet our climate aspirations. So thanks again to everyone for joining us today. We will make the webinar recording available to everyone. We've also had some requests for some of the links of some of the publications that were listed and mentioned, and we will share those as well. So thanks again to everyone for attending. And yes, Thursday, the webinar is exactly at the same time. We always keep it at the same time. So thanks again to everyone, and goodbye.